I was 19 when I started shopping secondhand like it was a sport. It wasn't thrift chic back then in my town. It was just what you did when your paycheck from the grocery store barely covered gas and rent for a room with a lock that didn't always catch. I told myself I liked the hunt for its own sake, but the truth was simpler. I liked the feeling of beating the system, of getting something better than I could afford because I'd been clever enough to find it. I'd grown up on rock radio and hand-me-down CDs. Nirvana wasn't something I discovered. Nirvana was in the air, like cigarette smoke in the back of someone's car. I knew the songs the way you know the names of streets you've driven on for years. I liked them, sure, but I wasn't a devotee. I didn't have posters or bootlegs. I didn't treat Kurt Cobain like a saint. That mattered later, in the way people tell themselves they weren't reverent so they couldn't have done anything wrong. The jacket was hanging on a metal rack between a trench coat that smelled like mothballs and a puffy ski thing with a broken zipper. It wasn't flashy. It was a worn olive green parka, the kind you'd wear in a damp place where winter didn't feel crisp so much as wet and resigned. The cuffs were frayed. One pocket sagged like it had carried too much for too long. There was a faint, old smell in the lining, stale smoke, maybe, and something sweet that reminded me of laundry left too long in the washer. It fit me, which was the first reason I bought it. It sat right on my shoulders, heavy without being stiff, like it had already learned the shape of a person. When I put my hand in the inside pocket, my fingertips caught on something stitched there. Two initials, small and careful, like someone had marked it so they could find it again. K.C. I laughed under my breath, because it felt like a joke the universe made for people who wanted to see patterns. I told myself it could stand for anything. Kevin, Karen, Kansas City. I bought it anyway, for $28 plus tax, and wore it out of the shop like I'd stolen it. A week later, my friend Denny stared at me across a table at a diner and said, "Where'd you get that?" Denny was the kind of guy who could talk to anyone. He played guitar badly but passionately. He knew the difference between admiration and worship, and he lived closer to the worship side than I did. He had opinions about tone and pedals and authenticity that felt like religion. "Thrift store," I said, proud. He leaned forward and touched the cuff like he was checking a bruise. "Dude, this looks like..." "Like what?" He swallowed, eyes wide in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Like the parka Kurt wore in those photos. The ones in Seattle. The green one." I felt a small, annoyed flare. "It's just a jacket." Denny shook his head hard, like I was being willfully stupid. "No. Look at the stitching. Look at the pockets. Look at the lining. You don't get it." The thing is, I did get it in the shallow way that matters when money's involved. If he was right, even a little, then the jacket wasn't just warm. It was worth something. I told myself that was practical, not greedy. I told myself anyone would think the same. Denny begged me to let him take photos and post them on a forum. I said yes because I liked his excitement. I liked being the person who had the thing. He took careful pictures of the cuffs, the zipper, the inside tag that was faded almost to nothing. He zoomed in on the initials. "Don't go nuts," I warned, but my warning didn't come from caution about truth. It came from fear that he'd attract attention I couldn't control. Within hours, people online were arguing. Some said it was a common brand, some said the stitching looked right for the era, some said the initials were too neat. A few comments came from users who claimed they'd worked in Seattle clubs in the early 90s. One wrote, "If that's real, you don't understand what you have." I sat at my cheap desk, reading those words over and over, and felt a strange heat in my chest. It wasn't reverence. It was opportunity. Then a private message popped up from someone with a username that sounded professional. They asked where I'd found it. They asked if I'd sell. They used words like provenance and authentication. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to believe the jacket could just be mine. A lucky find that didn't come with complications. But luck isn't comfortable when it's expensive. The first major turn came with a phone call from my mother. She didn't call often back then, not because we were estranged, but because we didn't have the kind of relationship that needed daily maintenance. We were polite. We loved each other in a careful, conditional way. She said my younger sister, Katie, was behind on tuition. She said my mom's hours had been cut. She said the car needed work. She didn't ask me for money outright, but the request hung in the pauses. After I hung up, I stared at the jacket draped over my chair and felt something in me harden into a plan. I told myself I wasn't exploiting tragedy. I was fixing problems. I told myself a jacket was just an object, and my family was real. Denny texted me that night. People are asking, seriously asking, don't do anything without me. I can help. That was Denny's fatal mistake. He said, without me. I told myself he didn't get to claim a share of my luck. I told myself he hadn't bought the jacket. He hadn't spotted it. He was just excited, and excitement doesn't earn ownership. When the professional-sounding collector messaged again with an offer, $10,000 pending verification, my fingers shook as I typed back yes. We met in a motel conference room off the interstate, the kind with carpets patterned to hide stains and coffee that tasted like burnt pennies. The collector brought a man who introduced himself as an authenticator. He wore gloves and spoke softly, like he was in a museum even though we were under fluorescent lights. They examined the jacket in silence. They measured seams. They checked the zipper brand. They compared wear patterns to printed photos they'd brought in a binder. At one point, the authenticator turned the lining inside out and paused at the initials. K.C., he murmured, and his voice changed slightly, like he'd stepped into something serious. They didn't declare it real on the spot. They said it needed further verification, maybe fiber analysis, maybe chain of custody research. But the collector looked at me with a kind of hungry restraint and said, if you can let us take it to our lab, I can increase the offer. Denny would have asked questions. Denny would have insisted on contracts and receipts. I wanted money, and I wanted it fast enough to feel like relief. So I did something I still replay. I handed it over without a lawyer, without even making a copy of the flimsy agreement they slid across the table. I accepted a cashier's check for $25,000 as good faith, and I told myself I just made a smart adult move. On the drive home, the seat beside me felt wrong without the jacket. The air felt colder even though it was summer. I told myself that was nostalgia for an object and not anxiety about what I'd just done. I didn't tell Denny. I didn't tell my mother where the money came from either. I said I'd gotten a work bonus and a tax return. I paid for Katie's overdue tuition. I fixed my mom's car. I felt briefly like the kind of person who showed up. Then Denny called. His voice was bright at first. Any updates? I lied without pausing. Nothing. People online are just talking. There was a quiet stretch. Then he said, you sound weird. I'm tired, I said. He accepted it because Denny trusted people by default. That trust was something I'd always envied and quietly mocked. I told myself trust was naive. A week later, the collector emailed me. The subject line was, confirmation. They'd found photo matches. They'd spoken to a former band associate. They believed, with high confidence, that the jacket had belonged to Kurt Cobain. They offered $380,000 for full ownership, contingent on my signing a release and non-disclosure agreement. My hands went numb. It was so much money it didn't feel like money. It felt like a door opening onto a different life. I signed. I wired details. I did it quickly, afraid the offer would evaporate if I hesitated. The second major turn was that I didn't feel joy. I felt fear of losing it, fear of being exposed, fear of what it meant about who I'd become in a matter of weeks. The jacket disappeared into someone else's world. I never saw it again. The money landed in my account in a single clean transaction that didn't carry any smell of thrift store or old smoke. I paid off my debts. I moved into a better apartment. I bought things I told myself I didn't care about. A nicer car, a couch that didn't come from someone's curb. And then, because I couldn't stand the discomfort of having done something secret, I started acting like the secret wasn't there. I told myself nobody got hurt. I told myself Denny would have made it complicated and I'd have lost the deal. I told myself I'd been decisive. Denny eventually found out anyway. Not from me, but from the internet. A collector posted a blurred photo of the jacket in a private group. Someone recognized the stitching from Denny's original forum post. People connected dots the way people always do when there's gossip and a whiff of celebrity. Denny showed up at my apartment unannounced. He didn't yell. That would have been easier to dismiss. He stood in my doorway with his shoulders slumped and said, "You sold it." I tried to keep my face neutral. "It's just a jacket." His eyes flashed. "You used me. You used my knowledge to price it, and then you cut me out." "I found it," I said. "It was mine." He shook his head slowly, like he was watching something collapse. "It was yours to decide what kind of person you'd be," he said. "And you decided." After he left, I sat on my new couch and stared at the blank TV screen. I told myself the friendship would have ended eventually anyway. That was my third lie, the one that made the next decade possible. Time did what time does. It layered ordinary life over the ugly parts. I got an office job. I married later than most of my friends. I had a daughter, Emma. I became the kind of middle-aged man who tells himself he's stable because the bills get paid on time. The jacket story became something I carried in a sealed compartment. I didn't talk about it, not because of the non-disclosure, though that was convenient, but because the more years passed, the more childish and small my actions looked. It's one thing to be selfish at 19 when you're still forming. It's another to hold that selfishness in your hand at 45 and see it hasn't aged into anything noble. Once, at a work happy hour, someone brought up memorabilia auctions. A coworker joked about rich weirdos buying celebrity clothes. I laughed along, too loudly. On the drive home, I felt sick and couldn't say why. I told myself it was buried. The jacket was gone. Denny was gone. The money had been converted into mortgage payments and braces and groceries. There was nothing left to haunt me. That belief lasted until my daughter turned 16 and found Nirvana on her own. Emma discovered the music the way teenagers do now, through algorithms and mood playlists. One night she was in the kitchen making ramen, earbuds in, and she said, casually, "Dad, did you ever listen to Nirvana?" I nearly dropped a plate. My pulse spiked over a band that had been background noise for years, and I hated how obvious my reaction felt. I said, forcing calm. She took out one earbud. I don't know. It makes me feel less alone. She shrugged, embarrassed by her own sincerity. Anyway, there's this exhibit coming through Seattle. Like Kurt stuff. Guitars, letters, clothes. My friend's mom said it's amazing. Could we go? Seattle. Clothes. My throat tightened. I managed, maybe, and pretended to check my phone. That night, I lay awake listening to my wife's breathing and felt the old sealed compartment in me start to leak. Emma didn't know my history. She just wanted a trip with her dad. But the request pulled a thread I'd tied off years ago. A week later, Emma showed me an article on her laptop. A museum had acquired a rare olive green parka believed to have belonged to Kurt Cobain, and it would be displayed as part of a traveling collection. There was a photo partial angled, but I recognized the sagging pocket like it was a face I'd once loved and betrayed. The third major turn was realizing the past wasn't buried. It was on display with lighting. I tried to talk myself out of it. I told myself museums show things all the time. I told myself it didn't matter. Then an email arrived in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line, Inquiry regarding provenance. The sender introduced herself as Marin, a collections researcher. She said they were finalizing documentation for the traveling exhibit and had traced early forum posts that appeared to match the jacket. They were seeking confirmation of origin for their records. They wanted to speak with me. My hands went cold in the familiar way. I'd spent years pretending I was safe because nobody cared. Now someone cared, and not in a way I could charm away. I considered ignoring it. The non-disclosure agreement flashed in my mind like a shield. But then I thought about the first agreement I'd signed in that motel room. Flimsy, incomplete, rushed. I'd never kept a copy. I'd never verified who those people were beyond their confidence and their gloves. What if the collector had built a story around the jacket that wasn't true? What if the museum's paperwork depended on my silence? What if my silence had helped someone else profit the way I had? I replied that I wasn't comfortable discussing it and cited the non-disclosure. Marin wrote back politely and said they understood, But there was an additional complication. A competing claim had surfaced from someone alleging the jacket had been taken without permission in the early 90s from a rehearsal space. They were trying to resolve it. My chest tightened. Theft, not thrift. A chain of harm I'd never considered because it interfered with my preferred narrative of lucky find. The next collision came through Denny. I hadn't spoken his name in years, but he showed up in Marin's follow-up email as someone who had posted the original photos. She'd reached out to him too. She said he'd responded quickly and was eager to assist. I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Of course he was eager. He'd always wanted truth more than comfort. He'd always wanted the story to be what it was, not what benefited him. A week later, Denny called me. I hadn't given him my number. That meant he'd worked for it or someone had handed it to him. Either way, it made my skin prickle. "I'm not calling to fight," he said immediately, voice older, steadier. "I'm calling because this is bigger now." I wanted to hang up. Instead, I said, "What do you want?" He exhaled. "A woman contacted me. Museum. There's a claim the jacket was stolen before it ever hit a thrift store. If that's true, then the money trail matters. The story matters." "I signed agreements," I said, the old defense. "Yeah," he said flat. "You always did." There was silence. Then he said softer, "I'm not asking for a cut. It's too late. I'm asking you to stop hiding behind 'it was mine.'" You know how that sounded, even then. I felt something shift. Not into redemption, but into discomfort that had finally matured into guilt. Because he was right. My justification had been legalistic, not moral. Emma kept asking about the Seattle trip. I kept dodging. My wife noticed. She asked me one evening why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told her. Not all the details, not at first, but enough. I'd found something once, sold it, and it was now in a museum, and there were questions. My wife listened, brow furrowed, and said, "How much did you sell it for?" When I told her, she didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She just went quiet in a way that made me feel suddenly exposed. "And you never told me," she said. "I didn't want it to define me," I said. She looked at me with something like sadness. "Maybe it already did," she said. Then she said the sentence that changed the shape of the situation. "If Emma finds out from someone else, it will hit her differently than if she hears it from you." I knew she was right. I also knew telling Emma would make me smaller in her eyes. Parents think they can control how their children see them, and it's a shock when you realize the image is borrowed, not owned. Meanwhile, Marin emailed again, asking if I'd be willing to provide even minimal confirmation. The thrift store name, the year, any documentation. She said the competing claimant was pursuing legal avenues and the museum needed clarity. I had none. I had a memory and a bank transfer and the weight of choices. I agreed to speak with Marin on the phone, with my wife sitting across the table, silent but present. I told Marin what I remembered. The shop, the rack, the initials. I told her about the collector without naming him, because I genuinely didn't know if he'd been legitimate or simply polished. Marin listened carefully. Then she said, "The claimant is a man who worked as a stagehand in Seattle in the early 90s. He alleges the jacket was left in a shared space and later disappeared. He's not claiming it's worth money to him. He's claiming it was part of a life he witnessed, and that the story has been rewritten by people with cash." That phrasing, rewritten, landed in me like a stone, because I had rewritten the story too in my own way to make myself the lucky protagonist instead of the link in a chain. After the call, I went into Emma's room. She was sprawled on her bed with headphones on, a notebook open, lyrics scribbled in the margins like she was trying to translate emotion into ink. I sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I need to tell you something about that exhibit." She pulled off her headphones, wary. "Okay." I told her I once found a jacket in a thrift store that later turned out to be Kurt Cobain's. I told her I sold it when I was young, and I didn't handle it well, and now there were questions about who it belonged to before it reached the store. Emma stared at me, face unreadable. "You sold Kurt Cobain's jacket?" she said finally, voice flat with disbelief. "Yes," I said. "And you didn't tell me," she said. "I didn't want to be the guy who—" I started. "The guy who made money off a dead person?" she finished. sharper than I expected. I flinched. She wasn't being melodramatic. She was being 16 and honest. The fourth major turn was realizing my old selfishness had become a story my daughter now had to hold, whether she wanted to or not. The museum postponed the jacket's display pending review. The claimant filed papers. The collector, whoever he truly was, didn't respond to inquiries, and his company address turned out to be a rented mailbox. My non-disclosure agreement looked less like protection and more like a smokescreen someone had used because I was young and eager and cheap to manipulate. Nothing dramatic happened to me. No police at the door. No headline. Just a slow tightening of consequences. My wife's guarded looks, Emma's distance, the quiet way my daughter stopped asking me to go places with her. She still listened to Nirvana, but now when a song came on in the car, she turned it down instead of up. Denny testified in a deposition I heard later, describing the jacket's appearance and the forum posts. He didn't mention me with venom. He mentioned me like a fact. Marin thanked me for cooperating. The claimant never contacted me directly. The jacket remained in limbo, held in a climate-controlled room while adults argued over paper. Months passed. The money I'd made decades ago stayed where it had always been, transformed into ordinary life. I couldn't return it cleanly because there was no clean recipient. I couldn't undo the lie because it had already done its work. One night, I found Emma in the kitchen, rinsing a mug, shoulders tense. I said, "I'm sorry," because the words were all I had left. She nodded once without looking at me. "I know," she said, "but it doesn't fix it." Later, alone, I opened a drawer where I keep old things. Receipts, faded photos, meaningless papers. I stared at the empty space where a jacket had once been, and I understood something I'd refused to learn at 19. You can sell an object, but you can't sell the part of yourself that chose the easiest path. That part stays, collecting interest quietly. Some debts don't come with collectors. They just sit in your own house, waiting for your children to notice the missing warmth.